The fact that I was born uh, with four absent siblings, uh, and I mean absent. Uh, One of them I didn't meet until I was uh, eight, seven. And then the next one I met when I was eight. The next one I didn't even know existed until I was 12. And the last one I didn't know existed until I was about 26 or 27 years old. The fact that I was born with these four absent siblings, these people from my own life and history, two of them I had no idea existed, and two of them had left because of conflict with mother. The fact that happened really threw a wrench into my life in serious ways. But at the same time, some of it may have, and this is all second guessing. We do this all the time in our lives about, what about the path not taken, etc., etc. But all of this may have benefited me as well, just by virtue of where it landed me geographically in the world. The fact that three of these children, of these siblings, were essentially abandoned by my mother. They all had, except for one, which I'm going to get into all of these people, but they all had issues. They had issues as they got older. They wanted answers. They wanted answers. Why was I abandoned? Why did you do these things to me? How am I supposed to live my life coming from the environment that you created, this toxic place? And these were the questions that were coming at my mother fast and furious as I was growing up. And rightfully so. But at the same time, I lived in the same toxic environment, and while it absolutely affected me, I see shadows of my mother's life and actions and thought processes in my own life every day. And I don't like it. It's not something I'm proud of. And like when I was 7 years old, I met my sister, Nanette. She came to visit us the year before my dad died. And she seemed, I was unaware of, I really didn't even know who this person was. I was told my sister was coming to visit us, but I didn't even know I had a sister. I heard her spoken of around the house, but I didn't know who she was. I just didn't know who she was. And I don't remember the boys Bob and Joe ever talking about her. I know that Mom and Dad mentioned her, usually during fights. And I think Mother may have been writing to her. She was living in Ottawa, and we were in London. And she came down to see us for a few days. And I thought she was wonderful. She was another tall, blonde Amazon woman like my mother. And she seemed nice. She treated me nice. I remember walking up the road to the beer store with her. And her, I was carrying a dozen beer. It was really heavy for me. I was only 7. A dozen bottles of beer. And her coaching me along and think I fell that day and got on my knee, and she got me in the house and bandaged me up, and she was a nice woman, but I had no idea what was going on behind the scenes. But I knew there was something, because there was something weird going on in the house with her and mom and dad. There was something that was not right. There was a tension in there that I couldn't quite put my finger on, and I didn't understand what it was. I was 7. This was very confusing. And something tells me there was a little bit of an argument or an altercation near the end of this visit, and then it left. And I wouldn't see her again for nearly 20 years. Nearly 20 years. It would be 16 or 17 years or 18 years before I'd ever lay eyes on her again, but it wasn't the last time I was going to hear from her. And her problem with Mother became much more apparent as I went into my teens. My mother was a prolific letter writer. She wrote letters to everybody. She used to buy these little, 8 by 4 or 5 writing tablets with a liner that you'd put underneath the blank page so you could see lines through it. And so you'd write straight on this blank unlined paper. They don't even have those anymore, but she used to use those. And she would write letters to people constantly. She was writing to her sister Wilda. She wrote to Dave. She wrote to Joe. Joe was just across town, and she would write to Joe. And I don't know if she wrote to Bob, but she was a communicator, and she wanted to. She was not a quiet person. Some of that is actually legendary. Her phone call sessions, where she'd get on the phone and be yelling and screaming at directory assistants for people's numbers that they couldn't find because she wasn't providing the right information to get the number. These things were legendary. They were highly entertaining. I would sit there and just watch her, and I'd hear one side of a conversation with whoever she was calling, and it was really funny. There was one point during a drunken phone call session where she called somebody. I don't remember who it was. But she was drunk, really drunk. We were home alone in Kitchener at Holborn, and she ended up in a conversation with the phone company. I don't remember why. It might have been because our bill wasn't paid, but probably what. My mother was really good at that, even though we had no money. She never let bills go. And so I don't know how this happened, but she ended up on the phone with Belle. And she I don't even remember what the problem was, but she got in this massive argument with this poor Bell employee. And she got so ugly, cursing and swearing at this guy about I don't remember what it was, that the guy hung up and they turned the phone off. They turned our phone off. And so she lost her mind, and she said, "We're going to the mall." And out the door she went. I didn't know what to do, so I followed her. Well, instead of walking up there, she decided not to walk up. She was going to drive one of the cars up there. So in the Oldsmobile I get, she gets in the car, just tears out of the parking lot, laying rubber all the way, drives a block and a half down, 2 blocks down to the mall, jumps out of the car, we walk into the mall, and there's this bank of payphones on the wall, right across from the Canada Trust Bank. The TD Canada, what's now TD, was just Canada Trust back then. And it was our bank. We banked there. I had my first bank account there. She had her money in there. And it's a busy day. There's a big lineup of people right across the hall, right across the hallway there from these phones. And my mother puts a dime in and calls. Actually, I don't think she did that. She just called an operator and demanded to speak to the phone company. And they put her through, unbelievably. Well, she went on a obscenity-laced tirade at the top of her voice, and everybody was walking by me and her, and I was just standing there like I didn't know what to do. I was laughing too, because she was being so incredibly outrageous that it was just like something out of a Monty Python skit. It was out of control, and racial epithets and slurs and you're this and you're that, and all of a sudden I looked over across the way to the bank, and everybody in the lineup was looking at us. And when I noticed this, she happened to turn her head and see them as well, and she starts screaming across the mall hallway, what the F are you looking at? Mind your own GD business, blah. And she just rips these people in the bank. And then finally, she got so angry. These are the things that surprised me about how she never ended up in a mental hospital or a jailhouse. She got so mad at this guy on the phone that she started beating the crap out of the phone with the receiver, to the point where she tore the whole receiver out of the phone, cord and all, smashed the crap out of the phone with it, and just threw the receiver on the ground and walked away. Stormed away out the door. And as we're going out the mall door, this poor old man is walking in, and he doesn't know what's going on. He has no idea what's happened. She walks out and just tears a strip off of him for no reason, and he's just sort of standing there in shock. And she's like, what are you looking at? Blah, 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 blah. And she just loses her mind on this guy. And then we get back in the car, and she almost kills us 30 times and goes back to the house. And by the time we get back to the house, they turn the phone back on. I don't know how she managed to pull these things off, but they were so outlandish that they were funny, but at the same time they were very frightening, because this woman was really, really angry and violent and dangerous, and people didn't have a clue. They looked at her and saw an old fat woman, but she was not an old fat woman. She was terrifying. And the only thing you could do when she went on these rampages was either laugh or hide. That was it. So that day, her rage wasn't directed at me, so it was funny. So I laughed. And it was funny. It was so ridiculous what she did and got away with it. And the looks on everybody's faces. It was just like something out of a movie. It was completely surreal. And so this letter writing ended up opening a chapter in everybody's life that we did not expect. She had been writing, apparently, or maybe she received a letter and answered it, from Viva, Aunt Viva, the woman in Digby that had taken in her first son, my half-brother James. And somehow, through that process, and this is really weird because it was not something she did. Later on in this story, she demonstrated a very unpleasant denial and resistance to accepting another of her abandoned children. But for some reason, I think, I'm not sure who made the first call, but I'm pretty sure that Viva told my mother where James was. He was living in a town in Nova Scotia called Northfield. And she decided that she was going to make contact with Jim. And so there was a phone call. And I don't even really know what was in that call, but it turned out to be a positive event. James accepted, Jim accepted her overtures, whatever they were. I don't know. Because he wanted answers. He wanted answers the same as Nanette wanted answers, and yet another sibling that would come later. He wanted answers, and he wanted to talk to her, and he wanted to understand why he had been abandoned and raised by strangers and didn't know his father and had somebody else's last name that, it was I can imagine, actually I can't. I really can't. I only put myself in his shoes or any of the people in my family because I know them well and I love them, and they're part of this sick little club that my mother created, and this dysfunctional little group of people that came into contact with her or were left behind by her. Either way, we're all looking for answers, right? Like, why the hell did you do these things? So that phone call led to a lot of things happening. On the same timeline during this period, both Bob and Joe had both gone up to Thunder Bay to see Dave on different occasions. Bob went up to actually work with Dave in his construction business. And that didn't work out so well, I guess. It didn't last. Bob ended up back in Kitchener. And Joe had gone up for a visit, and, they had played music together and hung out and did whatever. And Dave had come down, and seen us again, and there was a family unit forming again after Dad died, and it seemed to be Mother pulling this all together. I don't know. It was probably a bad move to follow her lead, but because she had a way of skewing every relationship. She couldn't be happy with all of us at once. She was always fighting with one of us, right? And trying to get the others to take sides with her. And she did that continually. It never ended, right? So here comes Jim into the picture. And we find out that he's married and has 3 children, lives in Northfield, is a good man. And so at some point, after Bob's failed attempt to join Dave's construction company, Bob gets introduced to a young woman who I'm not going to name her because there's no point. But he meets a young lady who has a newborn child, and he fell in love. He'd already been married at this point, but to a woman. He got married when he was 18 or 19 years old to a woman, and that marriage didn't last at all because Bob was a rebel. Bob was a biker, tough guy, drank hard, partied hard, worked hard. He was a good-looking man. He had the long, curly blonde hair. He was muscles in his poop, and he was a badass. So he married a woman initially that was from cultured people, and yeah. So it didn't work out. I don't think it lasted a year. So there he was, single again at this point. And he met this young lady with a newborn child, and he fell in love, and he more fell in love with the child. He loved that boy, and took him as his own, and so they became, this was something that to us that we were looking at this and thinking, well, this is serious. Like he's settling down here, and he was. That's what he was doing. He was gonna, follow that path with this, and the woman was much younger than him, and so that started to happen, and we all loved her. She was a very sweet, kind of naive, kind-hearted person, and she seemed to make Bob incredibly happy. My mother liked her, which was really weird, and maybe we should have known by that. And my mother loved the boy, and I loved the boy. I thought he kind of grew up around us. I remember meeting him when he was just a baby in arms, and then when he was 2 or 3 years old, I used to play with him. We were just little kids. He was much younger than me, of course, but I used to play with the little fella, right? And I thought he was a great little kid. At some point in time, around 1979 or 80, Bob decides, because he had met this woman through some people in Kitchener who were from Nova Scotia, fellow Nova Scotians, and they moved back to Nova Scotia, to a town called Bridgewater, which I think is where they were from. I'm not exactly positive of that, but so at some point in time, they somehow talked Bob into moving down there with the woman and the child, because the woman was close friends with these people, and they had helped her out, when she was, a single mom and all this stuff. They had introduced her to Bob and all of these things, right? So they talked him into going down there, and they were, there was a Michelin plant down there in Bridgewater in those years. I think there still is. And they were saying, you can get, because Bob was a talented guy. He was a licensed truck driver. He was a great mechanic. He could do anything he put his mind to. So they facilitated him moving down to Nova Scotia with the new woman. Well, she wasn't new anymore by then. They'd been together a couple of years maybe, and they got down there, and they found a nice mobile home in the woods up in Cherry Hill there, and they loved it there, and that's when things started to happen. I think at that time Bob had actually went and met Jim, and they got along famously because Jim was a tough guy too. Jim grew up a fighter. He was a amateur boxer. I think that he even won some awards as a boxer. And he was a tough guy. He settled a lot of things with his fists, and he was an angry guy, right? But not all the time. But the anger was coming from everything I described prior to this. Like he had that streak in him where he was pissed about his life, but at the same time, he loved his life. And he had a great family, and they loved him, and they still do. And he was a real, he was a Renaissance man kind of guy. He could build houses. He could mechanic. He was a fisherman. He did everything. He was just one of those guys, right? So him and Bob were, finest kind together. So that suddenly we're talking about all of us moving to Nova Scotia. And when I say all of us, I mean all of us. Me, Mother, Joe, and by this time now, David. Dave is talking about all of us packing up everything and moving down to Nova Scotia. Not only that, but moving down there and living in the same house together, all of us, except for Bob, of course. Bob already had his own place, but with me and Mom and Joe and Dave all living together. Whew, boy, that's a lot to take in. In 1981, we bought these humongous, 3 by 3 by 5 feet tall cardboard crates and put wood skids on the bottom of them to keep them together. Mother and I and Joe packed everything we owned into these gigantic boxes, about 6 of them. And we sold everything we had that we couldn't take. And we packed it all up and we shipped it to Nova Scotia. And so Bob was already down there. Dave decided to drive his crappy Chev pickup truck down with all of his stuff. And Joe was going to drive down with him. Me and Mother were going to get on a train and go down. So Dave, bless his heart, shot both of his dogs because he knew he couldn't take them and he didn't want to give them away. They'd been with him since pup, and they were old, and he couldn't stand to leave them there or give them to somebody else. So, and he didn't want to put them to sleep. Like he didn't want that to happen. So he shot them. He put some nice food out and shot his dogs. This was going to come up later, like just one more trauma in his life, right? After surviving cancer and his wife leaving him and his life turning to crap, then he has to shoot his own animals. So, sure enough, I'll never forget it. Mother and I took a cab to a motel near the train station the night before, stayed there, and the next morning we got on a train. And it was the most magical thing I ever saw or did in my life to that point. The train ride from Kitchener, Ontario to Halifax, Nova Scotia, my God, it was awesome. It was awesome. There was a song going through my head on that whole trip, and it might sound cliche, but that was the first trip where I actually saw my own country. I had no concept at that point just how big Canada is. And the sights on that trip, which took, I don't know how many hours, it was a long time. And we didn't have a sleeping carriage or anything, a sleeping car. We just sat in the regular seats, and watched the country go by the window. I remember going over the bridge across the St. Lawrence and thinking, oh, I had never in my life seen anything like that. The whole procedure just blew me away. I was blown away to see the sheer size of my own country. And then, of course, like I said, because of the vehicle I was in and the music I listened to, there was only one song going through my head that whole trip. And it was a Lightfoot song. And I couldn't help but think about it. And that trip was like the end of an act in a play and the beginning of a new one. I had no idea at the time what all of this meant to me. It was going to mean to my future and what I would end up doing. And I honestly believe if we hadn't have moved to Nova Scotia, that there's a possibility I may never have done anything that I've done. There definitely wouldn't have been the people that I met in Nova Scotia that pushed my career forward. I wouldn't have met any of those people. And I may have met different people in Ontario, but it's hard to say. It's hard to say what would have happened, except I know one thing for sure. Coming to Nova Scotia, which was coming home for the rest of my family, I was the only one that wasn't born there. But as I've said earlier, I was raised in a Nova Scotian home. No matter where we were, we didn't act like we were from Ontario at all. We lived our lives as if we were still in a fishing village in Cape Breton. That's how everyone lived their lives and saw the world. And so I was really excited on this trip to find out what made my family the way it was. Because by this time, Nova Scotia was a legendary place to me that up until that point, I didn't think I'd ever really see. I was 12 years old and thinking, well, this is my life. I'm here in Ontario. I live in a city. This is my friends. These are the things that I do. I was sort of already indoctrinated in the Ontario existence. And all of a sudden, here I was heading for the place that spawned my entire family. And I had never seen it. It was a magic trip. And as many horrible things has happened to me here in this province, horrible things happen to you everywhere. But I owe this place a lot. And the people here, I owe them. I don't think that I would be who I am if I hadn't been given this place as a home and a base of operations and a place to discover who I was, as I didn't know who I was up until this point. I wasn't one of these people. I found that out quickly, but I soon fell into it, because it came so naturally to me from watching my own family. Pretty soon, it wasn't long after we arrived in this province that I was a fully fledged Nova Scotian at Cape Breton all the way, because it's in your blood. It's in your blood. This place is in your blood. If your family's born here and you're raised, by those people, you'll never get this place out of your system. And so that train ride and that song playing in my head for a couple of days almost, I think it took to get here, and stepping off that train into the Halifax train station and seeing one of my brothers for the first time, laying eyes on him. That train ride was the beginning of my life. From that moment on, I would never be the same.
There was a time in this fair land when the railroad did not run, and the wild, majestic mountains stood alone against the sun. Long before the white man and long before the wheel, when the green, dark forest was too silent to be real. Well, time has no beginnings and history has no bounds. As to this verdant country they came from all around. They sailed upon her waterways and they walked the forest tall, built the mines, the mills, and the factories for the good of us all. And when the young man's fancy was turned into the spring, the railroad men grew restless for to hear the hammers ring. Their minds were overflowing with the vision of their day, with many a fortune won and lost and many a debt to pay. For they looked in the future, and what did they see? They saw an iron road running from the sea to the sea, bringing the goods to a ungrowing land, all up from the seaports and into their hands. Look away, said they, across this mighty land, from the eastern shore to the western strand. Bring the workers and bring up the rails. We're gonna lay down the tracks and tear up the trails. Open our heart, let the lifeblood flow. Gonna get on our way, cause we're moving too slow. Bring in the workers and bring up the rails. We're gonna lay down the tracks and tear up the trails. Open our heart, let the lifeblood flow. Gonna get on our way, cause we're moving too slow. Get on our way, cause we're moving too slow. Behind the blue Rockies, the sun is declining. The stars, they come stealing at the close of the day. Across the wide prairie, our loved ones lie sleeping. Beyond the dark ocean, in a place far away, we are the navvies who work upon the railway, swinging our hammers in the bright blazing sun, living on stew and drinking bad whiskey, bending our backs till the long days are done. We are the navvies who work upon the railway, swinging our hammers in the bright blazing sun, laying down track and building the bridges, bending our backs till the railroad is done. So over the mountains and over the plains, into the Muskegon, into the rain, up to St. Lawrence, all the way to Gaspé, bringing our hammers and drawing our pay, driving them in and tying them down, away to the bunkhouse and into the town. $1 a day and a place for my head, a drink to the living, a toast to the dead. Oh, the song of the future has been sung, all the battles have been won, on the mountain tops we stand, all the world at our command. We have opened up the soil with our teardrops and our toil. For there was a time in this fair land when the railroad did not run, and the wild majestic mountains stood alone against the sun. Long before the white man and long before the wheel, when the green dark forest was too silent to be real, when the green dark forest was too silent to be real. And many are the dead men, too silent to be real.
God bless you, Gordy Lightfoot. Thank you, sir.